Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. I'm sorry I was not here for the rest of the testimony. Lots of meetings going on at the same time. You know, I find this whole hearing just so frustrating. I represent West Virginia. We have some of the lowest deployed broadband in the country. I feel like we've been talking about this over and over and over again to try to figure out why we can't get service to other places. We hear different reasons, and then the inaccuracy of the maps and all this. So I think you'll find in a bipartisan way, we're really interested in helping you and everybody else solve this issue. So I guess my first question, West Virginia is going to be a part of that, of the new NTIA updating the 8 state partners, because we have a broadband council that's been very aggressive with this, because we've decided that the FCC and others can't meet this challenge. We're going to have to do it ourselves. I guess the one thing I would ask is, do you find that with, and I'll just throw it open to whoever, with the inaccuracy of the data that we have right now that we know is inaccurate, has this been part of a move that has snuffed out competition in the more rural areas and the more diverse areas? Because we don't have competition, we're getting more and more, but we don't have competition. Nobody's competing for these last mile kinds of deployment of broadband. Does anybody have a comment on what the effect of poor mapping has done for the competitive environment in the areas that are still left under or unserved? Yes, Mr. Donovan.
Well, Senator, so we have a bit of a catch-22 here, that in these rural areas, you are only eligible for resources in places where there is no unsubsidized competitor. But if we have the map saying that there's unsubsidized competitor, then you're not eligible for the money. So that brings it straight to the core of today's hearing, that there are resources and programs available to help states like yours have expanded service, but we need to make sure that the right areas are eligible so that competitors can go into those markets, bid for support, and build out service.
So the way it's structured and with the poor mapping has led to a non-competitive environment in a lot of places, which is what's slowing it up. So I'm on a bill with Senator Klobuchar because we're concerned, we're on the Rural Broadband Council, that the deployment in the urban areas is not apples to apples as it is in the rural areas. I mean, that's pretty obvious. So we want to get the standards that we're expecting in the urban areas. We want to get our standards in the rural areas to be at least comparable. And so far, we haven't seen that. Does anybody have a comment on that initiative?
Well, it's not anything new. Congress has directed the creation of Universal Service Fund program to have reasonably comparable services in urban and rural areas. I think that the challenge now is to make sure that we look at what is considered to be reasonably comparable, and that's the services that the program is delivering. As we're now a fifth of the way into the 21st century, that needs to include having access to the latest wireless technologies.
The other excuse on why West Virginia in particular doesn't have as good deployment of broadband is our terrain. We are the mountain state. I hope you've visited there. It's very nice. And I have a hard time believing that, because I believe for decades we've been talking to, we've been able to communicate with people on the moon, and we can't figure out a way to deploy broadband in a mountainous state. So I think it's just an excuse, again, as to why we haven't had deployment into maybe the less profitable areas and more populated areas. Does anybody have a comment on the challenges of deploying broadband in terrain and what that would do towards the availability of broadband?
So, Senator, the funds are generally distributed now on a reverse auction basis. So the carrier that can bid the least to provide coverage over the most square miles wins the support. One thing that should help for states like West Virginia in Mobility Fund Phase 2 is the now inclusion of a terrain factor.
Right,
so
we got that in there. Yeah.
So as long as we make sure those areas are eligible, that terrain factor will help.
Mr. Spalter, did you have a comment?
I did, very briefly. First of all, thank you for introducing your legislation with Senator Klobuchar and advancing our future for mapping. It is true that terrain, distance, and other factors do impede and make more expensive different kinds of broadband deployment. To pull fiber to various terrains, particularly in mountainous areas where the underlying topographies can be challenging, We know that for pulling a mile of fiber, a linear mile of fiber can range anywhere from $20,000 linear mile to over $100,000 linear mile, depending on where you actually, what kind of terrain you're traversing. So these are real economic impediments that have to be thought through in a public-private way, and why we actually need to continue to focus on our goal of extending the opportunities for direct grant support through mechanisms like the FCC's Universal Service Funds and Connect America funds, added by and accelerated by a national comprehensive and harmonized maps of where broadband serviceable locations are and where they're not. And if we can do both, we are going to be able to, I think, and I hope, stoke competition, potentially make the cost of broadband deployment less, and actually, most importantly, serve our ultimate goal of getting rural broadband to more rural Americans.
And at the root of it is the accuracy of the data that we have in hand. Thank you.
Absolutely.